Hello there, welcome along to our latest look at the Weatherquest farming forecast. Now last week Zoe spent some time looking at the damaging frost that had happened in the week prior to that video, causing some significant issues with viticulture, for example, but also some potato crops and so forth being badly burnt by the frost earlier on this month. I'm going to spend some time in this video looking at just how dry it's been and that sort of impact that's having on crop production as well. And first up, this first image here, this map shows how much rain we've had so far this month up until the end of the 25th of May there. And this is using radar estimates compared to the long-term average for the whole month of May. So 25th of May is roughly 81% of the way through the month. So you would expect in an average month to be around 81% of normal rainfall, in other words somewhere in that white shading there. And quite clearly much of England and Wales at least is well into the brown, in fact some places significantly so. There's a good swathe across central and southern Britain that have seen less than 10% or even less than 5% of their normal rainfall for the month of May. Marham in West Norfolk, for example, has only seen 0.4 millimetres of rain for the whole month, which is barely anything at all. Whereas in stark contrast, Western Scotland, here we're 150%, maybe even 200% of average. In other words, twice as much rain as we would normally expect on some of the hills in Western Scotland. Much of that fell at the end of last week into the beginning of the weekend just gone, with a lot of tropical moisture being brought in off the Atlantic and piling onto those western upslopes of Scotland for a couple of days, just non-stop rain here. We saw well over 100 millimetres on some of the hills here during the course of last weekend. So stark contrast across the country, very wet in the northwest, incredibly dry across many parts of central and southern parts of the UK, and that's having a big impact on farmers in particular. Now these two maps here, another way of looking at how dry it's been, I guess. The previous map was absolute values of rainfall that we've seen. These two maps here look at how long a period of dry weather each part of the UK has had between each batch of rain. So on the left hand side here, that's 2020 so far, and on the right hand side that's comparing it to 2018, of course, a fairly recent year where we had a prolonged dry spell during the spring and summer months. So on the left hand side, this is showing the longest dry spell that anywhere in the UK has had so far this year. This isn't necessarily in the last few weeks, it could have been in February or March, for example, but just showing you this sort of typical length that some places have gone without a single drop of rain, that is 0.2 millimetres or more. And for much of central and southern parts of the UK, this month has had 20 plus days of absolutely no rain across some parts of the southern half of the UK, until we got to Saturday and we saw a few showers, a few blustery showers, thundery showers on Saturday across southern Britain in particular, and that's just reset the clock for some places over the last few days. But there are still some sites across East Anglia and the South East that are around 25 days now without a single drop of rain. Now compare that to 2018, and here during that year we saw as much as 45 to 50 days, 51 at Broomsbarn in West Suffolk during that particular year. So that was quite a significant prolonged dry spell. In fact, I think the longest dry spell we'd seen since 1976 at least across some parts of the UK. So we haven't quite got to that stage yet, but there isn't very much rain in the next week or so. We're going to add at least another 5, maybe even 10 days on top of the 25 we've already seen in southern parts of the UK for the next week or so. So it is going to get into the 30s, I suspect, for some places before we see any measurable rain, however small that may be, as we go on into June. How does that compare with previous years? Well, right now it looks like East Anglia will probably end up having its driest May on record. We would have to get 9 millimetres or more to break the record, which was set in 1989. Right now we're sitting on around 3.3 millimetres, something around that value for the month, and very little expected the rest of this week. This is looking at the driest months, so not just May, but any month since records began. And right now records start in 1862. And you can see the top 5 there are all 3 millimetres or less. The driest month at the top of the table there was April 2007. That was then followed by a very wet summer with lots of flooding in parts of Yorkshire in June and parts of Gloucestershire in the July, the 20th of July 2007. So it doesn't mean it will be a wet summer, of course, but that's how it went from one extreme to the other in just a couple of months. But quite a selection of different years on here. Note it's not a necessarily recent event. having dry months. You know, some of the values here, 1959, even as early as 1891. So a real selection of different years, randomly distributed over the last 150 years or so. But most of them have been in the spring months. February, March and April are typically the driest 3 months of the year, and they appear more frequently in the top 10 of those driest months. As I say, right now for East Anglia, which is what this table is valid for, we are sitting somewhere around 5th place. When the final figures come in next week, it may adjust slightly as we get more data coming in, but it's likely to be probably in the top 10 of driest month on record. So not just May, but any month that we've seen over the last 150 years. Not at the top, we've had a bit more rain than we saw in April 2007, but somewhere in the top 10 by the looks of things. And David got in touch with me on Twitter at the end of last week to try and highlight the impact that the dry weather is having on some of the crop production here. And he says here, in terms of his wheat, heavy land wheats are now really feeling the pain from this dry weather. The crop is trying to compensate by racing through the growth stages, and as a result it's losing tillers. And he's quite concerned about how dry the soils are, how powdery the soils are. There's hardly any moisture left in the surface layers at least, but potentially at depth as well in some places. Some people have been reporting it's quite dry to quite considerable depths right now. And of course it's been quite a bad combination really over the last few months. It's been often sunny, so a lot of solar radiation. It's been fairly warm as well, and we've had some quite strong and dry winds coming in from the east, and all of that combining to really increase the evaporation rates over the last couple of months and really dry out those soils after what was a very wet second half of winter. Now in terms of water supplies, ground storage and reservoirs, supplies right now are actually pretty good because we had a very wet winter, so we've got a lot of water in storage, but in terms of river flows and surface layers, that is starting to feel the impacts already. And it's still only May. We've still got many more months of potentially dry and warm weather to come over the next few months or so. So is there any rain in the forecast? Well, in the short term, for the next 7 days at least, not a great deal at all. And that's thanks to this big area of high pressure sat over the UK, which continues to be the case this week. We have got a weather front notice to the west of Northern Ireland, and that will eventually bring a little bit of rain in across Northern Ireland into northern and western Scotland through Wednesday and Thursday. Elsewhere, it's pretty much dry. Notice how that high drifts a bit further east as we go through this week. So no longer right over the UK, just drifting a little bit with time up towards Scandinavia. And that allows more of an easterly flow to develop. So the breeze may pick up a touch later on this week. But overall, quite a bit of sunshine, very warm, especially across western parts of the UK with a bit of föhn effect away from that onshore wind. And maybe towards the weekend, notice as that high drifts just a little bit further away, we may see a little bit of showery rain getting into, again, Northern Ireland, Western Scotland through Saturday and Sunday. Elsewhere though, at this stage, it's still a pretty much dry picture by the looks of things through the weekend. So we need rain, not really any showing up to the end of the month. Sunday, of course, is the last day of May. Spraying conditions, well, it's been good for spraying, I guess, over the last few days or so, and will continue to be the case through this week. So again, the green shading here is where it's dry and the winds are below 10 miles an hour. It may get a bit breezy at times around the coast in particular this week, especially during the second half of the week, but overall a lot of green even into the weekend. Away from that far northwest corner of the UK where we may see a bit of rain, but even through the weekend, winds probably fairly slack, so in other words, good conditions for spraying. Now I know it's not all bad news, of course, because if it's dry outside, some of you have actually managed to get a cut of hay already and may then try and get a second cut during the more traditional period of hay making in June and July, for example. So dry weather not necessarily bad for everyone, but obviously is having some sort of impact in at least some sections of agriculture as well. So if you're keen to know if it's going to rain in your part of the world, or if you're trying to go out spraying and you want to know the day-by-day detail for your particular location, then by all means give our forecasters a ring. Yes, we're working from home, but we're very much available from 6 in the morning through till 6 in the evening on our forecast hotline, as we always are, and we're here to answer your questions, whatever it may be about going forward over the following weeks and months ahead. So is there any rain beyond the end of the weekend? Well, looking further ahead into next week, notice the high by early next week has now shifted off towards Scandinavia, so it's moved a little bit further away from us, and that potentially allows this area of low pressure over the Atlantic to come a bit closer in to the western side of the UK. Now at this stage, there's still a bit of uncertainty about how far east that low will get. It's unlikely to get all the way to the east of the UK, but the question mark is how much showery rain may we see pushing into western parts of the UK during the beginning of next week. Now that low itself is going to take an odd track, if you like. Trough disruption is what's going on in the upper atmosphere. And what that basically means is the area of low pressure is going to slide southwards, primarily to the west of Ireland, down towards western Portugal through the early part of next week. So it's not expected to come right over the UK pushing east. It will head south instead, but a glancing blow may give some rain or showers to western and southwestern parts of the UK early part of next week. It's still likely to stay fairly dry and sunny and so forth across eastern parts of the UK, again with that drying breeze, that low dew point air coming in from the nearby continent. Once we get to midweek onwards, there's quite a bit of uncertainty. Now, over the last few weeks, at this sort of time range, we've felt relatively confident how things might be looking the following week. But now we're getting to that time of the year where uncertainty tends to grow a little bit more. There's less temperature contrast going on over the North Atlantic. The jet stream is not particularly active right now, and that creates more uncertainty about how things might evolve looking further ahead down the line. So this is one possible scenario by the middle to latter part of the week, sort of Wednesday, Thursday onwards. This is sort of around the 3rd or 4th of June, I guess, onwards. So you can see that low pressure having now sunk all the way down towards the west of Iberia. That's where the main low is, but a secondary low likely to develop somewhere over northern France. High pressure over the Atlantic ridging across the UK, and then north of that, another area of low pressure you'll notice near the Norwegian Sea. So we're sort of sandwiched between two lows and this fairly large ridge in between. And the question mark is which one of these sort of three features will win out through the second half of next week. Now it's possible in this configuration many areas could still stay dry through the second half of next week. However, that low pressure over northern France could well push some showers or thunderstorms up from the south at times into southern parts of the UK. The question mark being how far north will they get before they weaken and fizzle. And if that does happen, that could well import some quite warm and humid air into the south and southwest of the UK. So potential for some fairly warm and muggy conditions to develop across southern parts of the UK at some stage during the second half of next week. Equally, that low to the north of Shetland could actually nudge a bit further south and bring some showery rain into the north and the east of the UK as well. So some question marks here about how the second half of next week will play out. One other scenario is to take that low over the nearby continent and push it all the way further north across the UK. And this is a possibility. It's got low chance of happening right now based on the latest data, but it's something to bear in mind that if the low does develop more substantially across the nearby continent and push further north, then it may well turn a bit more widely unsettled during the second half of next week. But there's a lot of uncertainty about exactly how things are going to play out right now. The most likely scenario is a continuation of dry conditions, especially the further east you are, but there is just a chance we may see some rain or showers or even thundery bursts of rain and humid conditions pushing up from the south during the second half of next week, the second half of the first week of June. So this is how things look using our ensemble data, all averaged out for the week as a whole. And you can see the red shading there, the higher than normal pressure extending from the Atlantic across the UK, the lower than average pressure just to the north of Shetland and also to the south of the UK, just creeping into that south coast as well. So you can see we're sort of sandwiched in between the two lows and that ridge sitting over the top of the UK. So a bit of uncertainty about how things will play out. Now at the moment it looks like if warm air does get drawn up from the south, then it could be quite warm at times across southern parts of the UK, hence the above average temperatures here. And the further north you are, the more likely your temperatures are to be nearer normal for early June, for example. And in terms of rainfall, you can see the southeast corner at the moment being flagged up to be near normal. That implies rainfall because typically you'd expect around sort of 12 millimeters here in a week at this time of the year. So that implying that there's more likely to be some rain in the south than not, but elsewhere the brown's dominating, meaning dry weather is more likely. So there are hints that we may see some thundery imports trying to come up from the south. The question mark is how far north do they get if they ever make it across the channel in the first place. It could be a very close run thing potentially during the second half of next week. Now beyond that, the signals start to become a lot weaker. If you've been watching these videos for quite some time, you'll know in the winter months the weeks 3 and 4 maps actually had quite a bit of colour on them, and we were able to pick out specific trends in how the pattern may evolve in the weeks to come. When you get to the summer months, as I say, predictability becomes a bit lower, things become rather slack. There isn't the strong jet stream that you typically get in the winter to drive the weather. So it becomes a bit more uncertain and moving forward in time as to how things may evolve, and trying to pick out these specific features at this time range can be quite tricky. Right now, the latest data is implying high pressure to the west of the UK, perhaps extending more over the UK during this time frame. Low pressure up towards the north over the Norwegian Sea potentially, but as I say, this will probably chop and change between now and then. In terms of temperatures right now, though, if the high is situated to the west of the UK and it extends a bit more over the UK, particularly across the southern half, then we may actually get into a bit more of a cooler northwesterly flow for a time. So temperatures coming down to near average or even slightly below average, notice, across parts of Scotland there. And in terms of rainfall, if high pressure is going to dominate a bit more through this period, then below average rainfall seems most likely, and that's what's showing up here. So not necessarily completely dry all the time, but at the moment I'm not seeing any signs of any major above average rainfall, and we haven't seen that for quite some time. And when the trends continue to suggest lower than average rainfall, it more often than not ends up being quite dry. And then for the final week of our forecast here, so through the middle part of June, again, barely any colour on this chart at all, a very weak hint of higher than normal pressure to the west of the UK. That just implies that low pressure is perhaps not as frequent as they would normally be for the time of the year. So overall, I think at the moment the most likely scenario is high pressure generally focused across the southern half of the UK into Western Europe, with that a fairly mild flow coming up from the southwest. So here above average temperatures, and in terms of rainfall, it means the southeast most likely to be drier through this period, and the northwest, notice Western Scotland coming up with slightly above average rainfall here, may turn a bit more unsettled across the northwest of the UK through mid-June, while the southeast is drier, not necessarily completely dry, but not as wet as it will be further northwest. But as I say, from about week 3 onwards, there's quite a bit of uncertainty, and it's hard to say really how things will play out that far ahead. Not seeing any particularly strong signals either way, not showing prolonged dry, but equally not showing a major pattern change either at the moment. So in short, the overview for the next few days, well, it's quite dry, it's quite sunny and warm for much of this week, and then as we go through the weekend, chance of some rain in Western Scotland, Northern Ireland, and then next week, some uncertainty, but perhaps a greater chance of some showers or longer spells of rain developing, particularly during the second half of next week, from about midweek onwards, moving up potentially from the south. Equally, we have to keep an eye on that low over the Norwegian Sea, because that may push down the North Sea and push a little bit of rain or showers into the northeast of the UK as well. But at the moment, the more likely scenario is a lot of dry weather, but the chance of some rain or showers working northwards through the second half of next week. And then thereafter, as I say, the signals are pretty weak, but probably more often dry than it will be wet. So, a lot of dry days still to come, I suspect, even though they may be punctuated by the odd wetter day as the odd front comes through or the odd thundery shower develops in the afternoons, that sort of thing. The greatest risk, though, through mid-June for rain will primarily be in the northwest of the UK, and generally drier the further south and east you go. So the hunt for rain continues for the time being. As I say, there may be a better chance of some rain developing, or showers at least, during the second half of next week. We'll have to see, but in the meantime, it's likely to be dry right the way through to the end of this month, and perhaps into the beginning of next week in most places as well. As ever, you can keep up to date with the latest day-by-day forecast by following us on social media, and of course our daily podcast for East Anglia is updated on our website. Bye for now.